The air in Jerusalem that morning carried weight. Not the weight of the humid spring heat that already pressed against the limestone walls of the Antonia Fortress, though that too was present. Not the weight of the thousands of Passover pilgrims who had swollen the city to 5 times its normal size, though their voices and bodies filled every available space. It was something else, something harder to name, a heaviness that settled into your bones before you even understood why. Those of us who stood guard that day, we who were trained to notice threats and disturbances, we felt it most of all. Something in the city was different. Something in the very fabric of that Friday morning whispered that the world was about to crack open. We were right. This is the story of the last 24 hours I spent as a Roman guard in Jerusalem, the hours that began on the evening of what the Jews call the Day of Preparation, and ended as the sun set on the strangest, most disturbing day of my 8 years in the legions. My name doesn't matter. History won't remember it. But what I witnessed, what we all witnessed, changed everything. This is April in the year 786, from the founding of Rome, or as some now counted, 33 in the year of Christ. And I am about to walk you through every moment of a day that still haunts my dreams. To understand what happened in those 24 hours, you need to understand where I stood in the machinery of Roman occupation. I wasn't a centurion or a tribune. I was a regular legionary, one of perhaps 200 soldiers stationed permanently in Jerusalem, tasked with keeping order in the most religiously volatile city in the entire empire. We were hated. Every day we walked through streets where eyes followed us with barely concealed contempt. The Jews called us Gentiles, unclean, invaders. They weren't wrong. We were the iron fist of Rome in a land that had never stopped dreaming of freedom. Most of us had learned to live with that hatred. You developed a thick skin or you didn't survive. But during Passover, that hatred intensified. The whole week was a celebration of how their God had freed them from Egypt, and the implication was never subtle. They wanted freedom from us too. So we doubled our patrols, watched the crowds more carefully, kept our hands close to our swords. The previous evening, Thursday, as the sun began to set, I had been assigned to the night watch. Nothing unusual about that. During festival weeks, we ran continuous patrols through the key sectors, the markets, the main gates, anywhere crowds gathered. My unit, 12 men under a decanus named Marcus Flavius, had been given the upper city, the wealthy quarter where the high priest and the Sanhedrin members lived in their expensive houses. Quiet area, usually. The rich knew how to keep their heads down. We weren't expecting trouble there. Around the 3rd hour of the night, maybe 9 or 10 by the way you'd count it now, word came down that the temple guard had made an arrest. Some rabbi they'd been watching. We didn't pay much attention at first. The temple guard arrested people all the time, usually for religious violations we couldn't have cared less about. Someone worked on the Sabbath, someone taught something blasphemous. It was all internal Jewish business. As long as it didn't threaten Roman order, we let the Sanhedrin handle their own problems. But then we heard the name, Jesus of Nazareth. That name we knew. Everyone stationed in Jerusalem during that Passover knew that name. He had arrived in the city 5 days earlier, on Sunday, and his entrance had been unlike anything I'd seen in my years there. Thousands of people had lined the road from the Mount of Olives, throwing palm branches and their own cloaks on the ground in front of him like he was a king. They had shouted, "Hosanna, save us, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord." It was the kind of display that should have triggered an immediate crackdown. When Jews start proclaiming kings, Rome pays attention. Kings mean rebellion, kings mean crosses. But our prefect, Pontius Pilate, had held back. Maybe he was waiting to see what would happen. Maybe he thought it was harmless religious enthusiasm. Or maybe, and this is what I think now, maybe he didn't want to start a riot during Passover, when the city was already overflowing with pilgrims. Whatever his reasoning, we had been ordered to watch but not act. So we watched. And this Jesus, he was strange. He didn't act like the rebels and would-be messiahs we usually dealt with. Those men came in angry, preaching violence, gathering weapons. This one taught in the temple courts. He talked about love and kingdoms not of this world. He healed people, or so the rumors said. He attracted massive crowds, but they seemed to come to listen, not to fight. Still, the chief priests were nervous. You could see it in how they moved through the city, in the extra temple guards they posted, in the worried conversations they held in corners of the porticos. They wanted him gone. And now, apparently, they had him. The arrest had happened in a garden on the Mount of Olives. One of his own followers had betrayed him, led the temple guard right to him. There had been a brief scuffle. Someone's ear got cut off. But Jesus had told his people to stand down. He'd gone quietly. By the time this information reached us, he was already being held at the house of the high priest, a man named Caiaphas. An emergency session of the Sanhedrin had been called, which was unusual. Normally they didn't meet at night, and certainly not during a festival. But they wanted this handled quickly before the people realized what was happening. I was curious, I'll admit. So when Marcus said we should swing by the high priest's compound on our patrol route, just to see if there was anything we needed to monitor, I didn't argue. We arrived at the courtyard outside Caiaphas's house around the 4th hour of the night. There was a fire burning in the center of the courtyard, where servants and some of the temple guards stood warming themselves. The spring nights in Jerusalem could be cold, especially at elevation. We kept our distance, watching from the shadows. We could hear voices from inside, raised and angry, though we couldn't make out words. Then we saw one of them, one of the men who had been with Jesus. He was standing near the fire, trying to look casual, but his face was terrified. A servant girl looked at him and said something. He shook his head violently. She pressed. We couldn't hear exactly what was being said, but his panic was visible even from where we stood. Then another person pointed at him, and another. Each time he denied whatever they were accusing him of, his voice getting louder, more desperate. Finally he turned and fled through the gate, and at that exact moment, from somewhere inside the compound, we heard a rooster crow. The man stopped as if he'd been struck. The look on his face. I've seen men look that way when they realize they've made a fatal mistake in battle. Absolute devastation. Then he was gone into the darkness. Inside, the trial, if you could call it that, continued. We heard later what happened. They brought witnesses who contradicted each other. They accused him of threatening to destroy the temple, of blasphemy, of claiming to be the Messiah, the Son of God. And apparently he didn't really defend himself, just stood there mostly silent until the high priest demanded a direct answer. "Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed One?" And Jesus answered, "I am, and you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven." The high priest tore his robes. "Blasphemy!" he shouted. They all agreed. Guilty, deserving of death. But here was their problem. The Romans didn't allow the Sanhedrin to carry out death sentences. We kept that power for ourselves. If they wanted him executed, they had to bring him to Pilate. And they had to convince Pilate that this was a matter of Roman law, not just Jewish religious disputes. So they needed to change the charge. Not blasphemy. Pilate wouldn't care about that. Insurrection. Claiming to be a king. Threatening Caesar's authority. That Pilate would have to address. As dawn broke, maybe the 6th hour, 6 in the morning, they moved him. We saw the procession from our post. Temple guards surrounding a figure in the center, hands bound. They were taking him to the Praetorium, the governor's headquarters, which was either at the Antonia Fortress or Herod's palace, depending on where Pilate was staying that week. We later learned it was Herod's palace, on the Western Hill. My unit wasn't directly involved at that point. We were rotating off duty, heading back to quarters for rest before the afternoon shift. But sleep didn't come easily. The whole fortress was buzzing with talk. A trial before Pilate, during Passover, first thing in the morning. This was significant. I lay on my bunk for maybe 2 hours, listening to the sounds of the city waking up, and then I gave up. I needed to know what was happening. I made my way to the palace complex. Other off-duty soldiers had done the same. We were drawn to the spectacle, the way soldiers always are. Pilate was not happy. You could see it in every line of his body as he sat in the judgment seat. He hadn't wanted this. The Jewish leaders had brought Jesus to him just after dawn, but they wouldn't enter the palace themselves. It would make them ceremonially unclean for Passover. So Pilate had to come out to them. Already he was irritated. He asked them what charges they were bringing. They gave him the revised version. "This man is subverting our nation, opposing payment of taxes to Caesar, claiming to be Christ, a king." Pilate looked at Jesus, this quiet figure who didn't look like any revolutionary I'd ever seen. He took him inside for a private questioning. What happened in that conversation we didn't hear directly, but word spread fast through the ranks. Pilate had asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And Jesus had answered with something cryptic, "My kingdom is not of this world. If it were, my servants would fight." Pilate came back out and said to the chief priests and the crowd that had gathered, "I find no basis for a charge against this man." You could feel the anger ripple through the Jewish leaders. They insisted, "He stirs up the people all over Judea by his teaching, starting in Galilee and now here." Galilee. Pilate's expression changed. Galilee was Herod Antipas's jurisdiction, and Herod was in Jerusalem for the festival. Perfect. Pilate could pass this problem to someone else. He sent Jesus to Herod. Herod was delighted, we heard. He'd wanted to meet Jesus for months, had heard all the stories about miracles, hoped to see some entertainment. He asked Jesus question after question. Jesus said nothing, not one word. Herod's delight turned to frustration, then mockery. He and his soldiers put an elegant robe on Jesus, made fun of him, and sent him back to Pilate. Message received. This is your problem, not mine. Now Pilate was stuck. It was maybe the 8th or 9th hour, mid-morning, and the crowd outside the palace had grown significantly. Pilate tried again. He called together the chief priests and the people and said, "You brought me this man as one inciting rebellion. I've examined him and found no basis for your charges. Neither has Herod. He's done nothing to deserve death. I'll punish him and release him." But then someone in the crowd remembered. Pilate had a custom, a political gesture really, of releasing one prisoner during Passover as a sign of goodwill. The crowd began to shout for their release. Pilate saw an opportunity. He had in custody a man named Barabbas, an actual rebel, someone who'd committed murder during an insurrection. Surely, if given the choice between Jesus and Barabbas, they'd choose Jesus. He asked them, "Which one do you want me to release?" The answer came back like a thunderclap. "Barabbas! Give us Barabbas!" Pilate was stunned. "What shall I do with Jesus who is called Christ?" And the crowd, stirred up by the chief priests, began to chant, "Crucify him! Crucify him! Crucify him!" The sound of it echoed off the palace walls, a rhythmic demand for blood. Pilate tried once more. "Why? What crime has he committed? I've found in him no grounds for the death penalty." But the crowd only shouted louder. His wife had sent him a message earlier, I learned later. She'd had a dream about Jesus and warned Pilate, "Don't have anything to do with that innocent man." But Pilate was trapped between his own sense that Jesus was harmless and the political reality that if he didn't act, the Jewish leaders could report him to Rome for allowing insurrection. He could see a riot beginning to form. So he did something theatrical. He called for a basin of water and washed his hands in front of the crowd. "I am innocent of this man's blood," he declared. "It's your responsibility." The crowd accepted. "His blood be on us and on our children." Pilate released Barabbas. He ordered Jesus flogged and crucified. That's when my 24 hours truly began. The flogging happened in the courtyard of the palace. I wasn't part of the detail assigned to do it, and for that I'm grateful. Roman flogging wasn't punishment, it was butchery. The whip we used, the flagellum, had multiple leather strands embedded with pieces of bone and metal. It was designed to tear flesh, to strip a man down to muscle and sometimes bone. The standard was 39 lashes, one short of what the Jews considered lethal. Most men were barely conscious by the end. Some didn't survive. Jesus survived, but barely. When they were done, the soldiers doing the flogging decided to have some fun. They'd heard he was supposed to be a king, so they made him one. They twisted together a crown from thorn branches, long spikes that dug into his scalp until blood ran down his face. They threw a purple robe over his torn shoulders. They put a staff in his hand as a scepter. Then they knelt before him in mock worship. "Hail, King of the Jews!" Then they hit him. They spit on him. They took the staff and struck him on the head, driving the thorns deeper. I watched this from the edge of the courtyard. I'd seen soldiers mock prisoners before. It was normal, a way to break the tension, to dehumanize the enemy so you didn't have to think about what you were doing to them. But something about this felt different. Maybe it was how quiet he was. He didn't scream or beg or curse. He just endured. His eyes, when you could see them through the blood and swelling, weren't filled with hate. They were, I don't know how to describe it, sad, like he pitied us. Pilate brought him out one more time. Maybe he thought the sight of Jesus, beaten and humiliated, would satisfy the crowd. He stood on the platform and gestured to the broken man beside him. "Here is your king," he said, with clear sarcasm. The chief priest shouted back, "We have no king but Caesar. Take him away, crucify him." So Pilate gave the final order. The execution detail was assembled. Crucifixion was Roman engineering at its most brutal. We had perfected the art of prolonged death, a punishment so horrific it was reserved for slaves and rebels, never for Roman citizens. The point wasn't just to kill, it was to terrify, to display what happened to anyone who challenged Rome. Every cross was a billboard advertising Roman power. My unit was assigned to the detail, 12 of us to crucify 3 men. Jesus and 2 actual criminals, thieves or rebels. The details weren't clear to me. A centurion named Petronius was in command. We stripped Jesus of the purple robe and put his own clothes back on him. Then we laid the crossbeam across his shoulders. It weighed probably 70 or 80 pounds. In his condition, after the beating and blood loss, it might as well have been 1,000. We began the walk to Golgotha, the place of the skull, a small hill just outside the city walls where executions were carried out. The route took us through the streets, deliberately, so as many people as possible would see. It was maybe half a mile, but every step was agony for the condemned. The streets were packed. Passover crowds filled every space, and news had spread fast. Some people were weeping. I saw women covering their faces, heard men shouting at us. But others were celebrating, mocking, satisfied that this troublemaker was getting what he deserved. We moved slowly. Jesus fell multiple times under the weight of the beam. Each time we pulled him up, but it was clear he wasn't going to make it. Finally, Petronius grabbed a man from the crowd, a big guy who looked strong enough, and forced him to carry the beam. The man's face showed terror. Being associated with a condemned criminal could be dangerous, but he had no choice. His name was Simon, from Cyrene. He carried the cross the rest of the way. Behind us a large crowd followed, including more women who were wailing loudly. Jesus turned to them at one point and said something. I was close enough to hear. "Daughters of Jerusalem, don't weep for me. Weep for yourselves and for your children." Then something about future days of terror. Even in his state, he was thinking about them, warning them. It was the kind of thing that should have made no sense, but somehow it did. We arrived at Golgotha around the 3rd hour, about 9 in the morning by modern reckoning. The hill was bare, rocky, just outside the gate. You could see the city walls clearly from there. The execution site was always visible, always public. We laid out the 3 crossbeams on the ground. The vertical posts were already permanently installed in the ground. We'd done this dozens of times. The process was mechanical. Strip the condemned, Pin him to the beam. Drive nails through the wrists, between the bones where they'd hold weight. Lift the beam and attach it to the vertical post. Pin the feet, either together or on either side of the post. Add the placard stating the crime. Walk away and wait. Death came from asphyxiation, usually. You could breathe in while hanging, but breathing out required pushing up on the nails in your feet. Eventually, exhaustion or blood loss or shock would make that impossible, and you'd suffocate. It could take hours, sometimes days. We crucified Jesus first, then the two criminals on either side of him. When we drove the nails through his wrists, he made a sound. Not a scream exactly, more like a deep groan. But then he said something that stopped me cold. "Father, forgive them, for they don't know what we're doing." He was praying for us, for the men hammering iron through his flesh. I'd never heard anything like it. Around me, the other soldiers continued working. If they heard, they didn't show it. Petronius had prepared the placard. Pilate had written it himself, apparently, in 3 languages, Aramaic, Latin, and Greek, so everyone could read it. Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews. The chief priests had protested, wanted it changed to, "This man claimed to be King of the Jews." But Pilate had refused. "What I have written, I have written." So we nailed the sign above his head. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Here hung the King of the Jews, displayed like a common criminal. By custom, we divided his clothes among us. There were 4 of us directly assigned to guard the crosses, standard practice to prevent anyone from taking the bodies down early. We took his outer garments and cut them into 4 shares, but his undergarment was seamless, woven in one piece from top to bottom. Too valuable to tear, so we cast lots for it, rolled dice there at the foot of the cross. I didn't win. Later someone pointed out that this fulfilled some prophecy from their scriptures about dividing garments and casting lots. I don't know about that. We were just following procedure. The crowd dynamics were fascinating and disturbing. The chief priests and religious leaders stood at a safe distance, satisfied, mocking. "He saved others," they shouted, "but he can't save himself. Let this Christ, this King of Israel, come down from the cross and we'll believe. If you're the Son of God, save yourself." Even the criminals beside him joined in at first. Both of them hurled insults. But then something changed. One of the criminals, the one on his left, I think, continued mocking. "Aren't you the Christ? Save yourself and us." But the other one, on the right, turned on him. "Don't you fear God? We're getting what we deserve, but this man has done nothing wrong." Then he looked at Jesus and said something I'll never forget. "Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom." He was dying, in agony, suffocated slowly, and this criminal was asking to be remembered in some future kingdom. Jesus turned his head toward him, the movement clearly excruciating, and answered, "Today you will be with me in paradise." "Not maybe, not if you're worthy. Today." A promise to a dying thief. At the foot of the cross, a small group of women stood watching, along with one younger man. They were clearly with Jesus, followers who hadn't abandoned him. One was his mother. I'd heard she was there. I can't imagine what it was like for her, watching her son die like that. The young man with them was John, one of his disciples. Jesus looked down at them and through cracked lips said to his mother, "Woman, here is your son," and to John, "Here is your mother," taking care of her even while dying, making sure she wouldn't be alone. John put his arm around her. She was weeping but silent, dignified in her grief. The hours passed slowly. It was our job to keep watch, make sure no one interfered, and wait for death. Around the 6th hour, around noon, the sky began to darken. At first I thought it was just clouds rolling in. Spring storms weren't unusual, but this was different. The darkness deepened until it was like twilight, like dusk, except it was the middle of the day. It lasted for 3 hours. 3 hours of unnatural darkness, while 3 men hung dying on crosses. The crowd grew quieter. Even the mockers seemed unsettled. There was no natural explanation for it. The darkness pressed down like a weight, like creation itself was holding its breath. During those dark hours, Jesus hung mostly silent. The physical toll of crucifixion was progressing. Each breath was a battle. His body sagged under its own weight. Then, around the 9th hour, 3 in the afternoon, he cried out in a loud voice. The words were in Aramaic. Eloi, Eloi, lema sabachthani. Someone in the crowd translated, my God, why have you forsaken me? The anguish in those words cut through everything. This wasn't just physical pain. This was something deeper, something spiritual that I couldn't begin to understand. Some people thought he was calling for Elijah. Someone ran and got a sponge, filled it with wine vinegar, put it on a stick and offered it to him to drink. He took a little. Then he said, I'm thirsty. His voice was barely a whisper. Everything was finishing. He could feel it. Then he said, it is finished. Not I am finished. It is finished. Like he'd completed something, a task or a mission. Finally he called out in a loud voice, somehow finding the strength. Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. And then he bowed his head and died. At that exact moment, the earth shook. Not a small tremor, a real earthquake that made the crosses sway, sent rocks tumbling, opened cracks in the ground. I was thrown to my knees. The other soldiers grabbed whatever they could to steady themselves. The darkness lifted as suddenly as it had come, light flooding back. And in that light and chaos, Petronius, our centurion, a career soldier who'd seen everything, stood staring at the cross. His face was pale. He said, loud enough for those nearby to hear, surely this was a righteous man. Another soldier said, surely this was the Son of God. We didn't use language like that. We were Romans. We worshipped Mars and Jupiter and Caesar. But something about what we'd just witnessed had shaken us to our core. The crowd began to disperse quickly, people beating their breasts, afraid, confused. The earth continued to rumble occasionally. Inside the city, we heard later, the massive curtain in the temple that separated the Holy of Holies from the rest had torn from top to bottom, ripped in two by invisible hands. The priests were in a panic, but our job wasn't done. The Jewish leaders came to us with a request. Tomorrow was the Sabbath, and not just any Sabbath, but a special high Sabbath during Passover. They couldn't have bodies hanging overnight. It would defile the land. They wanted us to speed up the deaths, then take the bodies down. The method for speeding death was crucifixion, breaking the legs. Without legs to push up on, the condemned would asphyxiate within minutes. We started with the criminals on either side, took a heavy iron mallet to their legs, shattering the bones. Their screams were brief. They died quickly after. But when we came to Jesus, he was already dead. We could tell. You learn to recognize it. Petronius wanted to be sure. So one of the soldiers, a man named Longinus, took his spear and thrust it into Jesus' side, between the ribs, into the area of the heart. Blood and water flowed out separately, a sign that he was truly dead, that his heart had already stopped and the blood had begun to separate. It was unusual, that water, but it was definitive. He was gone. We didn't break his legs. No need. Then something unexpected happened. 2 men came forward, both Jews, both apparently members of the Sanhedrin, but secret followers of Jesus. One was named Joseph, from a town called Arimathea. He'd gone to Pilate and asked for the body. Pilate had been surprised Jesus was already dead. He'd confirmed with Petronius, then granted permission. Joseph had brought expensive linen cloth and spices. The other man was Nicodemus, who brought a mixture of myrrh and aloes, about 75 pounds worth, a burial fit for a king. We helped them take the body down. It was heavy, dead weight, and stiff already. They handled him with reverence, tenderness even, cleaned him gently, wrapped him in the cloth with the spices according to Jewish burial customs. They were rushing, trying to finish before sunset when the Sabbath would begin and all work would have to stop. There was a tomb nearby, a new one carved out of rock, in a garden. It belonged to Joseph. They laid Jesus inside. Then several of us helped roll a large stone across the entrance, a massive disc that settled into a groove. It would take several men to move it again. The women who had been at the cross followed at a distance, watching where the body was laid. Then, as the sun touched the horizon, everyone dispersed. The Sabbath was beginning. The city fell quiet in that forced rest. But the Jewish leaders weren't resting easy. They came to Pilate with another request. "Sir," they said, "we remember that deceiver said while he was still alive, 'After 3 days I will rise again.'" They wanted a guard posted at the tomb to make sure his disciples didn't steal the body and then claim he'd risen. Pilate was exasperated. "Take a guard," he said. "Make it as secure as you know how." So we did. A detail of temple guards was assigned, and we helped them seal the stone officially, stretching a cord across it and fixing it with wax and Pilate's seal. Breaking that seal would be a crime against Rome. Then we posted guards. I wasn't assigned to that duty, thankfully. My shift was over. The 24 hours had ended. I walked back to the fortress as night fell completely. My body was exhausted, but my mind wouldn't stop. I kept seeing his face, hearing his words. "Father, forgive them. Today you will be with me in paradise. It is finished." I'd helped execute countless people. It was part of the job. You learn not to think about it, not to see them as human. But this one, I couldn't dismiss. There had been something different about him, something that the darkness and the earthquake and the centurion's words only confirmed. I didn't know what it meant. I didn't have categories for it. I was a Roman soldier. I followed orders. I kept the peace. I served the empire. But that day, on that hill, I'd been part of something that felt much bigger than Rome, bigger than anything I understood. Sleep didn't come easily that night either. I lay in my bunk listening to the conversations around me. Everyone who'd been at Golgotha was talking about it. The darkness, the earthquake, the way he'd died. Some were spooked, some were philosophical, some were already trying to forget. None of us could have imagined what would happen next. Sunday morning, 2 days later, the city exploded with rumors. The tomb was empty. The stone had been rolled away. The body was gone. The guards who'd been posted had a story about an earthquake and angels, and being so terrified they'd passed out. The Jewish leaders were scrambling, paying the guards to say the disciples had stolen the body while they slept. But that story didn't make sense. If they were asleep, how did they know it was the disciples? And would all of them have slept through someone moving that massive stone? The disciples themselves were claiming something else entirely. "He's alive," they said. "We've seen him. He appeared to us, spoke to us, ate with us, showed us his hands and side." Over the next weeks, the reports multiplied. He'd appeared to individuals, to groups, to more than 500 people at once. He'd spent 40 days teaching them, then ascended into the sky in front of witnesses. It was madness. Dead men don't rise. But the tomb was definitely empty. That much was confirmed. And these disciples, who'd all run away when he was arrested, who'd been hiding in fear, suddenly were bold, public, proclaiming this resurrection message even when threatened with the same fate he'd received. I don't know what happened in that tomb. I wasn't there. But I know what I saw on that Friday. I saw a man die. I saw him take his last breath. I saw the spear thrust into his side, and I saw in his life and death something that haunted me then and haunts me still. Years have passed now. I'm no longer in Jerusalem. The empire sent me elsewhere, other provinces, other posts. But I've never stopped thinking about that day. I've heard what happened to the movement he started. It didn't die with him. It grew. Those disciples spread across the known world, building communities, teaching his message, many of them eventually dying for their claims that he rose from the dead. People don't die for lies they invented. They die for truth they believe. I've also heard what happened to Jerusalem. About 37 years after that Passover, the city rebelled against Rome. We besieged it, starved it, destroyed it. The temple Jesus had talked about, the one he supposedly said he'd raise in 3 days, though they claimed he meant his body, we tore it down. Not one stone left on another, just as he'd apparently predicted. The world he'd warned about came to pass. Looking back now, I realize I was present at the hinge point of history. I didn't know it then. I was just doing my job, following orders, getting through another day in an occupied city during a tense festival. But that day, those 24 hours from Thursday evening to Friday sunset, the world changed. Something happened on that cross and in that tomb that sent ripples through time that are still expanding. The empire I served, mighty Rome, is gone now. But that movement, the one started by the man I helped crucify, it's still here, growing, spreading, transforming. I think about the words he spoke from the cross. Father, forgive them. Was I included in that? Could I be? I'd like to think so. I'd like to think that the forgiveness he offered to a dying thief might extend even to a Roman soldier who drove nails through innocent hands. This is what I witnessed in the last 24 hours of my service as a Roman guard in Jerusalem, on the day they called Preparation Day, in the year 33, in that count that starts with his birth. I was there. I saw him die. I felt the earth shake. I heard the darkness and the silence. And nothing in my 8 years of military service, nothing in all my training about power and empire and keeping order through force, prepared me for the possibility that the man hanging on that cross, broken and bleeding and dying, might actually have been who he claimed to be. That the kingdom he talked about might be real. That the victory he won wasn't through violence, but through surrender. That in his death, something died that needed to die, and in his supposed rising, something was born that could never be killed. I don't have all the answers. I'm just a soldier telling you what I saw. But what I saw that day changed me. And if the story is true, if he really did rise, if death really was defeated on that weekend in Jerusalem, then it changes everything for everyone. The air that morning had carried weight, I told you. Now I know why. The weight of sin and death and the curse of the world had settled on one man's shoulders, pressed down on him with thorns and nails and wood, crushed him into the earth. And 3 days later, that weight was gone, shattered, rendered powerless by an empty tomb and a risen king. That's what I believe now. I didn't believe it then. But I've had years to think, to weigh the evidence, to measure what I saw against what makes sense. And the only thing that makes sense of that strange, terrible, glorious day is that he was telling the truth all along. He was the king. He did have a kingdom, and his throne was a cross.